Hey! Well, welcome back, everyone. Hello, Buffs, to Mental Training Thursday. So appreciate y'all being here. This week's topic is timely. For some of us who are heading home or around folks where we're having conversations that might be difficult for us to engage with. So we really want to kind of develop a playbook for those courageous conversations you might be having as we enter the end of this semester. But before we do that, we always want to start off with and kick it off with a question that we received from a student athlete. This was from last week's MTT, which was on how to break up with chronic stress. And here's this question read to us by Chris.
So the question is, I'm heading home this week and I'm partly dreading what that will look like because my parents don't see me as an adult. They still see me as a child, which can be so frustrating. Any advice?
Again, a super timely question. I think this is an important one for us to really dive into, and so normal to the experience, I think, of being young adult and heading back home, and your sense of autonomy and freedom when we are on campus, when we've kind of left the nest, as some people like to call it. This may look very different for different folks depending on their communities, their family of origins. And on a whole, it can be really hard to return because we grow, we change, and sometimes the people in our lives, they don't see that process day to day. And so I think one of the things I just want to bring this back to is this idea of relational stress. So I think in many ways when we talk about how to break up with chronic stress, relationships are part of that. And how we build those relationships typically happens, in communication, shared activity, but really we all have this underlying need to be seen and to be heard, especially by, our loved ones. And so I think this makes so much sense. And what I'm hearing in this dread piece, so I know we had this metaphor last week around the two arrows that can hit us at times. And there's this primary arrow right now I'm hearing of being misunderstood, not being seen or heard by family members back home. And I think it's so important initially just to listen to that. So much of what we're taught as athletes is to prepare. And so I think this is one of these things, it's a translatable skill in a lot of ways. The same way we'd scout for a team, an opponent, same way we develop a race plan. I think it segues really nicely today into really leaning into what are those things you need? What's the dread telling you? And how to prepare for them. And so, I know today we're going to dive into this playbook idea of how to engage in relationships that, when in conversation can be fraught with difficulty, sometimes toxicity, where we don't feel heard or misunderstood, and know that this is something we'll probably keep coming back to because it's so important, not only for our relationships within our family and friend group, but also within our teams. I'll let Mac take it from here.
Yeah, I think this is such a timely time to have this conversation about relationships with our family members and how relationships on a whole impact us and what we're trying to accomplish or achieve. And so when I think about, these conversations and having a playbook at your ready for, I'm about to go home, and maybe you're aware that you and a family member, or you and a friend, or someone that's in your life don't necessarily see eye to eye on certain things, and that when home in these kind of contained spaces, even more so now with COVID life, it can be really difficult to be in those spaces and feel either trapped or like you don't know how to have a constructive conversation and you want to, or how to set boundaries that are going to keep things moving and keep everyone in a healthy relational space with one another. One of the things that we were talking about for today's Mental Training Thursday, because we know typically we'll give some kind of experiential exercise or activity or skill that you can utilize. And some of those you can actually pull into what we're going to talk about today, but we thought that it would actually be helpful to do like an actual play-by-play framework for how you can go into a situation like this. And the first thing to start and think about is that relationships and the connection within them, there's nourishment that comes from the communication that both parties give to one another. And so if you and I are in a conversation with one another and I offer you something that looks moldy, it smells pretty rancid, it's got flies, it looks dirty, it just doesn't look appetizing, that's likely not going to feel like something you want to engage in or ingest, right? That's probably something that everything about it is telling you, run the other way, do not do anything with this. It's not gonna feed you, and it's not gonna feed you well. I bring in that metaphor because it's a way to approach conversation. Are you entering that conversation and going to offer something that someone else is going to interpret and view as, this is something I can't digest? And what do you think that means as far as the ability for the two of you to be able to converse and discuss with one another? Now, maybe let's shift that metaphor to, well, what if both of you are trying to offer something to one another and both of you view it and deem it as valuable and nourishing, but there's still a slight difference. So for example, maybe I view mango as a fruit that is like the best fruit, the most nourishing fruit you could find. And I want to offer it to you because I think it's going to be better for you than maybe your perspective, which is, I really like strawberries. I think they're the best fruit out there. Both of them are fruit, both of them will nourish, but we each have our own preferences on that. And so we want to have a framework for when we go into conversations or relationships and recognize that we might both have our own preferences. And that doesn't make either of them wrong necessarily. I think the thing that can be challenging going into those dynamics is if we go in with an expectation or a perception of, I can change the way that they view what their view is. So if I went into that situation of, I can change your mind that strawberries are not where it's at, it's mangoes. Those kind of conversations tend not to be productive or helpful ultimately, because you're not going in with an intention of understanding and communicating with someone. You're going in with an intention of changing something or someone. And that's going to put up a defensive wall real quick from the other side. And you're just going to find yourself having more of this happening. So to give you some, very kind of tangible steps, think about pre-framing the conversation, whatever that conversation might be. If you know that this conversation is a difficult one to engage in with that other person and they know it too, it's not a bad idea just to name it and to acknowledge and say, hey, like, I know when we talk about these things, it can be a little challenging for both of us. And so why don't we set up some guidelines or ground rules for how we want to go about this? Maybe that includes you setting some guidelines for yourself of, I know that when I have these conversations, I feel really worked up. I notice myself feeling irritated. I feel myself getting frustrated. So I know if those things come up, I'm gonna start moving more towards that. Let me change your mind and tell you why I'm right, versus being able to stay in the moment and be able to actually converse and try and enhance understanding with one another. So maybe part of that pre-frame conversation includes guidelines for, if I need a timeout, I'm literally gonna say, hey, I need to take a timeout. Give me like 5 minutes to walk around the block so I can gather myself, and then let's come back to it. Having those pre-framing conversations really sets up what can happen and what it can look like. And that way it's not a surprise if in the middle of the conversation, you're like, I need a timeout, and those terms were already agreed upon. One of the other things that can be really helpful in approaching these conversations is finding ways to ground yourself in them. So in a lot of our mental training activities, we've done grounding strategies around body scans, around 5 senses, using your body and your feet on the actual floor to reconnect and to ground yourself and settle. So those are all things that you can engage in during those conversations if you know that they make you feel a particular way and help you keep a more level head. and stay more open to the conversation. And that's something that is another part of this playbook, is that curiosity factor. If you're entering conversations that might be emotionally difficult to have, if you can add a layer of curiosity to it, then it's going to give you space and interest to lean more towards that. How do I understand what this person is saying? And help focus on that side of it. And so that's another helpful strategy. And finally, it is important to know your boundaries. So there are times when, as much as we can frame a conversation, set appropriate and healthy boundaries for both parties, and exercise strategies to ground ourselves during those difficult conversations, all of that might not be enough. All of that could still mean that this is not a healthy or helpful conversation or topic to discuss. And so know that that is always an option as well in your playbook, is that if you've tried these strategies, if you've tried to set these frames and these conversations feel invalidating or hurtful or toxic or unhealthy, then it is also an appropriate option to recognize that and to state that these are not conversations that are helpful for either party. And so maybe we have to have a boundary to agree not to talk about whatever the subject matter might be. So I realize that I've given a litany of different play-by-play strategies for these difficult dialogues, and imagine that Bob might have either a reflection or an addition to it, but hopefully those will give you some tools in your toolbox for difficult dialogues.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mac. And truth be told, mangoes are one of my favorites as well. I have to name that. And I think it's really starting there. I just want to rename it. What is the nourishment that you're going to need, entering a space that is difficult, relationally, and starting with that piece, pre-framing it, having that playbook to know maybe what's going to come up for you, what's going to come up for the other person, how to ground yourself and know when to take a time out, and how you want to take a time back in. And I just want to re-offer that please do reach out to us at PHP. If this is a real struggle for you, if this is something that's coming up for you, we'd love to work with you individually, for an initial meeting, for more kind of ways to navigate home spaces or other spaces that can feel at times really fraught with tension and some of that relational stress that we mentioned earlier. And know that we're going to come back to this, because communication, nonverbal or verbal, is part of the connective tissue of teams, of relationships. It shows up everywhere. And so this is something that we'll definitely return to this spring. And thanks for joining us, as always, for those of you who are here, those of you who are rewatching this. And we really want you to join us next week. Our topic, this is going to be the last one for this fall semester, is Reflect for Refuge. So how do we reflect on a year that has been so challenging to give ourselves some of that strength, some of those reminders of our own resilience? That's what we're going to dive into next week. If you have any questions that you want answered, or for us to wander about, please email me at robert.diehl, D-I-E-H-L, at colorado.edu. And before we end, here's our quotation this week from Thich Nhat Hanh. And he says, in a relationship, we are nourishment for each other. So we have to select the kind of food we offer the other person, the kind of food that can help our relationships thrive. And we wish you well kind of at the rest of this semester, this holiday season, and continue to pay attention to those relationships that help you thrive. Go Buffs, and see you in 2 weeks.